Good afternoon, and thank you for joining us today, and we hope that you enjoy this webinar. Welcome to the Michigan-hosted Solve Climate by 2030 Power Dialogue. I am Amy Butler, and I'll be your moderator for the day, and Laura Young is also our co-moderator. These webinars are happening in concert in every state of the country right now, and several other international countries, to hear from our climate solution experts about ambitious but feasible actions that could happen soon to get states on track to solving climate by 2030. As an attendee, you will want to post a question in the Q&A section of the bottom of your screen. The chat function will not work right now. This is going to be a recorded event, so questions will be asked by me to our panelists, so that we can assure that the sound quality in the recording. I'm certain we're going to have a lot of questions and dialogue, so we might actually run over 5 or 10 minutes on the timing. We also encourage you to have further discussion after this event, and you will receive a follow-on survey as well as a link to the recording. Now, let's get on with the show. First of all, we're going to say thank you to the sponsors of the event, which are the Environmental Policy Center at Bard College, Cliff Bars and University of Connecticut, and the partners, Earth Day Network, Second Nature, ASHE, and the American Indian Higher Education Consortium. And with that, we have a brief introduction from our partner, Bard College. Laura, would you play our video?
Yes, I will. Just give me one moment.
Welcome to Solve Climate by 2030. Today, universities in almost all 50 U.S. states, Puerto Rico, D.C., and several other countries are hosting state and region-wide webinars focused on ambitious and feasible things that we can all do in our cities, our towns, and states in the coming year to really move the needle on climate change. Here is the most important idea to take home today. What you do locally will change the future. Fact, the U.S. state of Georgia is a top 10 solar state. The neighboring Sunshine State of Florida has very little solar power due to outdated laws and regulations. When we launched Solve Climate a year ago, we could never have imagined that today, entire countries and much of the world's economy would be shut down, with hundreds of thousands of people ill, thousands having passed away, and our health systems overwhelmed. I take that back. We could easily have imagined this. Our health experts and scientists warned us this was coming. After SARS and MERS, they told us this was coming, and yet we didn't take preventive action, we didn't prepare. COVID-19 has shown how fragile our health and economic systems are to extreme events. Our scientists have told us clearly that unchecked, climate change will turn our lives into an unending series of extreme events. Floods, droughts, rising sea levels, pests and disease, more extreme storms and hurricanes, all of this leaving hundreds of millions of people homeless and on the move. We can change this. We still have time to change that future. Last year, the world's top climate scientists told us that we have until 2030, 10 years now, to cut global warming pollution aggressively in order to stabilize the climate at the low end. That warning was the genesis for this national and international discussion today on how to solve climate by 2030. Solving climate in 10 years, that sounds challenging. And yet fixing the energy half of climate change by 2030 is looking more, not less likely than it was 4 years ago. The cost of solar and wind power, batteries, and electric vehicles have plummeted. In many cases, they are less expensive now than the fossil fuel power that causes global warming, and they are getting cheaper every day. Already, utility-scale wind and solar, big solar and wind farms that feed power into the grid, these technologies are crushing fossil fuels in much of the U.S. In Colorado, Idaho, and California, renewable bids are coming in at half the price that the cheapest fossil fuel plants can do. And this is where rooftop solar and battery systems are headed in the near future. On the vehicles front, all the major manufacturers see this coming. Mercedes-Benz announced last fall that they have designed their last gasoline-powered car. Going forward, every new model of theirs will be electric. Combining electric-powered vehicles with the impact of driverless technology, we could see a very rapid transition away from gasoline-based cars to EVs in the next decade. All this progress was the result of a major technology push by national governments. Starting in America in the 70s and then ramping up with the Danes, the British, the Japanese and Koreans, the Germans, and most recently the Chinese and Indians, government policies have brought these industries to scale. And now the market is taking over, and renewables, battery storage, and electric vehicles are on track to deliver power and transportation at prices unsubsidized that will lead to major disruptions of energy markets in the 2020s. Can we get there fast enough to solve climate? Well, this is where you come in. With plummeting prices for renewables and electric-powered transports, the pace of the clean energy revolution will no longer be determined by Washington, D.C. and other national governments. Instead, the core action is going to be in your city, at your electric utility, and in your state capital. The key to solving climate by 2030 will be clearing the path at the local level to rapid deployment of solar, wind, battery storage, and electric vehicles. We need to get rid of outmoded laws and regulations that are holding back the transition. Florida needs to take the lesson from Georgia. It's imperative that we have justice in this transition. We have to make sure that the millions of green jobs that are created are jobs for all, and that everyone has access to clean, affordable power and mobility. Today, in Nebraska and New Jersey, in Idaho and Alabama, in Bangladesh and Brazil, we're going to find out what are 3 ambitious but feasible things that we can do right at home to smooth the path for clean energy and to bring energy justice to our communities. Following the webinar, I hope you will join a group or class discussion about what you can do to make these solutions real. Then, what next? Well, this summer, young people in particular have a terrific opportunity to both support climate solutions and gain valuable job skills in a down economy. The most powerful thing you can do to solve climate by 2030 is to join the political campaign of a candidate who best represents your views on climate solutions. In doing that, you'll also learn how to communicate, you'll gain courage, and most importantly, be part of a creative, strong, powerful vision for the future. COVID-19 is giving us a stark lesson about what happens when we ignore warnings from science. Today, we'll see how 10 years can be enough time to drive the climate solutions that we need, and that the future will be what we make it. Thank you for the work you will do to solve climate.
All right, I'm going to stop sharing.
And now it's time for us to get to work in Michigan. And we have organized a set of esteemed subject matter experts in climate change that we're going to hear from today. Each will present and talk for just a short time, about 10-15 minutes, and then we will have questions. Again, if you have a question, put them in your Q&A section on the bottom of your screen. We also have already received some questions, so we will continue the dialogue. To start off with, we have Wolfgang Bauer, who is the Associate Vice President for Administration and University Distinguished Professor at Michigan State University, who will be talking about renewable energy policy and how renewable energy can help drive us towards climate resiliency. Wolfgang?
Thank you, Amy. I think I would like to share my screen right away so that I can show some PowerPoint slides, because that's much more interesting than seeing my moving face. So I want to make some general remarks first. These are things to consider, and the number one most important thing to consider I can write down as an equation, and the equation is energy is money. So for residential customers in Michigan, a kilowatt hour typically costs 15 cents. And we consume about 8,000 kilowatt hours on average per household per year in Michigan. And so that sets the scale what it takes to replace fossil fuel powered electricity by renewable electricity. The next thing that I always like to point out is that environmental sustainability must also mean fiscal sustainability. It's very easy to replace fossil fuel energy with renewables if money is no object. But eventually that money runs out. And so what we really need to show is that we can do it cheaper than going the conventional way. And so energy conservation pays for itself because that immediately translates into savings if it's done right. The greenest energy is the energy we don't consume. And that's money in our pocket right away. Now, next, an important point for renewables is that they don't need fuel. So the only fuel that really powers renewables is coming from the sun, and it's free to us, and it's almost inexhaustible. The amount of sunlight, the energy in the sunlight that reaches the ground on Earth presently is about 5,000 times the demand of all humans combined. So there's plenty of energy that's free, and that even holds for our latitudes. This is a map that you can find on the web. It used to be produced by 3M, but then they got bought by Vaisala. And it shows the direct and ambient time averaged radiation on Earth. The scale is in the middle at the bottom, and you see it's about from 165 to 235 watts per square meters. And the main thing that I want to show here is it's not so different for different parts of the surface of the Earth. We are, of course, here in the green region. And you can see Arizona or Florida are not doing so much better than we are, despite the fact that it seems to be cloudy almost all the time here. So solar is possible here, but solar is also intermittent, as is wind. And so energy storage is essential. And so yes, we need batteries, but also pumped hydro, compressed gas, and other ways to store energy that's intermittent. One of the underappreciated energy storage methods is to split water into hydrogen and oxygen, and then you can reform carbon dioxide into methane with the aid of this hydrogen and pipeline it in the conventional pipeline network that carries natural gas to almost everywhere in the United States anyway. So we have actually one of the largest batteries in the world in Michigan. And this is the Ludington Pump Storage Facility. And this is a picture that I took from Google Maps. And it shows Lake Michigan on the left and the artificially created lake on the right that holds 27 billion gallons of water. And the entire storage facility just pumps water up from Lake Michigan into this artificial lake. And when you need the electricity, these pumps are converted to turbines, and the water is let back down into Lake Michigan, generating the electricity up to 2.17 gigawatt total, by the way. So I want to talk about what we're doing at MSU. MSU is the largest university in Michigan. We have over 50,000 students. We're a member of the 62-member American Association of Universities. We're the leading universities in the US, leading research universities form an association. We're listed as one of the top 100 universities in the world. So is University of Michigan, by the way. We're a land-grant university with almost 5,300 acres of contiguous campus. And we're a living learning lab with our own power plant and microgrid. So we don't need to rely on a utility. We are our own utility. So in 2012, we made an energy transition plan that will eventually get us to 100% renewable energies. And I list the rather ambitious goals, and it stops there at 2030, where we want to have a 65% emissions reduction and a 40% campus renewable energy. This is not aggressive enough compared to the 2030 goal that we're all trying to envision here, but let me just tell you what we did so far and where we're going. So there's a long laundry list of of initiatives that we have undertaken. We've built a new recycling center and surplus store. Better than recycling goods is to selling them again and making use of them again. So reusing is better than recycling. We have also an organic waste composting facility. We implemented geothermal arrays in our nursing building. We built an anaerobic digester for food waste, converting it into electricity and also organic fertilizer. We built solar arrays, and I'll spend a little more effort on this in a minute. And most importantly, perhaps, we reduced our demand by very aggressive energy conservation measures, for which we spend between $5 and $10 million per year. We participate in the US Department of Energy Better Building Challenge and the Data Center Challenge. And we implemented these Spartan treasure hunts, where we go through each building and form alliances between the occupants of the building and subject matter experts, where we try to find ways to eliminate energy waste. So solar arrays. Solar panels are becoming more and more efficient and cheaper. And this is a rather busy graph. It shows residential, commercial, and large-scale PV installations and how their costs have developed from 2010 to 2016 or 17. And this is compiled by the National Renewable Energy Lab. And what you can see there is that costs have fallen by roughly a factor of 5 for large-scale installations, and it costs about less than $1 per installed watt. So if you have a 1 megawatt installation, it costs about $1 million or less now. So they're becoming more efficient and cheaper. And the magic tool that we have at our disposal are called power purchase agreements, where some investors provide the capital and earn returns on the capital. A solar developer builds the solar array or wind farm or other renewable installation. And then the buyer, in this case, Michigan State University, signs long-term contracts to purchase all the electricity generated by the renewable installation. This can be 10 years or, in our case, even 30 years. The current lowest prices, I looked this up this morning, for worldwide on these installations are wind at 3 cents per kilowatt hour. Remember, the Michigan residential price is 15 cents per kilowatt hour generated from fossil fuels. And solar in Spain is 3.5 cents per kilowatt hour. Michigan has this little bit of a problem that property taxes add significant expense, roughly 20% of the overall price. So for us, that's an added 1 cent per kilowatt hour that we have to pay. Governor Whitmer signed at MSU, by the way, in November 2019, bills that exempt renewable energy systems from this property tax, but there's an upper limit of 150 kilowatts. It would be nice if we could extend this and remove the upper limit. So these are the solar panels that MSU built. You can see them from space. This is actual satellite footage, and the yellow highlighted areas are solar panels. They are looking like this from close up. We covered 5,000 parking spots on 45 acres of parking lots with these solar panels, 40,000 of them. The maximum power yield, the design was 10.5 megawatt, but we actually find that on a bright and sunny day, we get 11 megawatt peak power. Over the entire year, we earn about 15,000 megawatt hours of solar energy from these, which is enough to power 1,800 US households year-round with electricity. An important point that I want to make is that this power purchase agreement makes electricity prices very predictable for us because they will not change for the next 25 years. And we, MSU, will save $10 million in electricity costs over that duration. So this is existence proof that green power is already cheaper than brown power. So we're not completely there. These arrays deliver 18% of MSU's peak power. They are the largest carport array in North America. Here's a night shot, but this is not enough. We're already working on an array twice as big, so we will triple our solar capacity within the next 2 years. This is a 20 megawatt array that sits on 100 acres of meadowland at the southeast corner of MSU's campus. It will have dual use. We will have sheep grazing under the array, and we will also install a wildflower pollinator habitat. So MSU's emissions in 2006 from electricity generations were almost 600,000 tons of CO2. And with the fuel switch away from coal to natural gas, with our anaerobic digester, our carport solar arrays, more efficient power plant design, and the proposed 20 megawatt solar array, we're coming down to 200,000 tons of CO2 per year. So we've already almost eliminated 2/3 of our CO2 footprint through these steps. I'm translating this into trees because it's pretty instructive. A tree can sequester away about, on average, 1,000 pounds of CO2 during its lifetime. There are about 700 trees per acre of natural growing forest in Michigan. And so the CO2 emissions reductions that we've achieved so far is equivalent to planting 800,000 trees each year. 800,000 trees each year, just from MSU's emissions reductions alone. And we're saving money. We saved 34% of our energy costs over the last 6 years. And the new solar array is projected to save us an additional $50 million during the next 25 years. So I think that provides instructive proof that true sustainability can be saving money, has to be saving money while saving the planet at the same time. I've exceeded my time, and Amy's already looking very nervous. So I'll leave it at this. My contact information is here, and please contact me with any additional questions. Back to you, Amy. You're muted.
Yep, I see. Thanks, Wolfgang. And next we're going to have Charles Griffith speak for a short time about the electrification of transportation. He is the Director of Climate and Energy Programs for the Ecology Center. Charles?
Thank you, Amy. Bringing up my slides now. Thanks everybody for having me. It's great to be part of this event. Thanks to MSU and the Sustainability Department there. I'm going to talk a little bit about the role of transportation in reducing climate emissions, and in particular about electric vehicles. But let me first just say something about, I work at the Ecology Center. I head up our climate and energy program there, and I also coordinate the Charge Up Midwest campaign, which is seeking to accelerate EV adoption across the whole Midwest region, working with a variety of partners. But why is it that we should care about electric vehicles and transportation? Well, first of all, it's because the transportation sector a few years ago has now become the largest sector in terms of carbon emissions. And that's partly because we've had some pretty good progress in the power sector. As Wolfgang was noting, in regards to MSU, we've seen a large drop-off in the use of coal, replaced by cheaper carbon-free renewable resources, and we've in some somewhat better natural gas. Now it's critical that we create a decarbonization pathway for the transportation sector, replacing oil now with low carbon energy sources. And most experts agree that the best way to do that is to electrify transportation. It's not just passenger vehicles. I wanted to point this out because we have, light trucks now make up the majority of emissions from that part of the that segment of vehicles that are sold. But we have other large trucks as well. So how do we get there? Well, as was referred to in the intro speech, the technology has now arrived. The costs of advanced batteries have continued to decline rapidly. And the good point about that is that electric vehicles could soon reach parity in terms of purchase price with conventional cars, which would really be a game changer. Automakers have also invested over 135, or plan to invest 135 billion in globally through 2030 on the development of new electric cars and trucks. And that could lead to having, a relatively few number of electric vehicle models available on the market today to literally hundreds by the end of the decade. Essentially, imagine having every type of car and truck that you see on the road today having an electric version available. Again, we're talking not just about passenger vehicles. We also have a variety of transit buses, school buses, delivery trucks, garbage trucks. There's even semi-trucks that are planned for the market in the next few years. And some of those will be built or at least designed right here in Michigan. But we need policies to support this transition, just like we saw for the power sector. For example, if we look at where renewables were even 5 years ago, coal was still the dominant energy source, and renewables were starting to show their potential. But look where we are today, where coal is now on its way out, and renewables are really taking off in the marketplace. Electric cars only make up 2% of vehicle sales today, but many think that they are where renewables were 5 or maybe 10 years ago. So look out for big changes in the next decade. But again, it took supportive policies in the power sector to help support that transition, along with developments in technology. So what do we need to do now to transition away from oil to increasingly low carbon electricity for transportation? Well, I think the first set of policies are really incentives and supportive regulations, starting with strong fuel economy and greenhouse gas standards for vehicles. Now, this is not, unfortunately, what the Trump administration did just last week, in promulgating new standards that roll back previously much tougher standards. That single action is arguably the biggest setback for the country's climate policy under this administration. Second thing we need to do is support states that want to develop their own clean car standards, like California and 14 other states now have done or are in the process of doing. Again, this is something, unfortunately, that the Trump administration has been fighting to roll back as well, and to take away states' ability to pass those standards. Another thing we need to do is to extend federal tax credits for the purchase of EVs, in part because the credits for companies like GM and Tesla have actually expired because they've reached this 200,000 vehicle limit that was set into the law. Now, this is something that Michigan Senator Stabenow and others have been seeking to change with new legislation, but Senate Republicans and guess who, the Trump administration, have been opposing this critical legislation. Another thing we can do is to have additional incentives at the state level for the purchase of EVs. A number of states like Oregon and California and Colorado have already done this. And so not surprisingly, EV sales have been stronger in those states. New Jersey also just passed strong incentive legislation in the last couple of months. And one thing I'll add is that a number of these states have increased the incentives for lower income individuals to buy EVs. So that's maybe important to think about from an equity perspective. But it's also just important to get more EVs out there so that there'll be more of them available to purchase for the roughly 2/3 of people that actually buy used vehicles as their primary vehicle. And finally, we need to get rid of onerous and unfair registration surcharges on electric vehicles. There's Michigan and 25 other states now have passed some form of fees that are used to help pay for road maintenance funding. Now, some of those policies are somewhat reasonable, but actually a number of them result in EV owners paying significantly more than they would for a similar gasoline vehicle. The Ecology Center has shown this to be the case here in Michigan with a new report on unfair fees that we released in January. But keep in mind that I think fees in the states with overly high fees are essentially penalizing drivers who want to go electric and avoid the use of carbon emitting fossil fuels. And this, again, will hurt lower income car buyers the most, who may want to buy an EV but are discouraged by the unfair tax treatment. The next set of policies that we need to consider are the getting more EV charging infrastructure out there. Essentially, and especially rather, targeting areas where they're needed the most, along highways, in apartment buildings, at workplaces. Fortunately, we've started to get utilities investing in some of this infrastructure, providing rebates to property owners willing to install chargers. The state of Michigan also has a program where they're starting to provide grants for EV charging, mostly along highways right now, using part of the VW settlement funds that the state has received. But we're going to need to ramp this up even more as the market accelerates. And doing things like the city of Chicago just did by passing a parking ordinance that would require 20% of all new parking spaces to be pre-wired to be charging EV charger ready. So all the wiring is in place. Now, I've pretty much run out of time myself, so let me just say that there are a number of other things that local governments, universities, schools, private businesses can do as well. The city of Ann Arbor, my last point will be that the city of Ann Arbor just released a carbon neutrality plan, which is aiming to reduce carbon emissions for the entire community by 2030. And that includes plans to electrify the entire municipal fleet, to transition and to help the whole community transition to electric vehicles. But I would also like to end on this note that not everybody owns a car or needs a car to get around all the time. So another important part of the plan and part of the broader plan, I think, needs to be increasing access to convenient public transit and walking and biking friendly streets. So that's my comprehensive approach to decarbonizing the transportation sector. I hope that you may be compelled to agree with some of that, and I look forward to your questions in the Q&A.
Thank you, Charles. And next for our speaker, we have Regina Strong. She is the Environmental Justice Public Advocate in the Michigan Department of Environment, Great Lakes, and Energy. And she will be talking about how and who we need to include in the conversation to drive solutions for climate change. Regina?
everyone. I'm really happy to be here. I'm really happy to, as a Spartan, I'm real proud to be with my, Spartan colleagues. I won't go too far, but I'm a little bit proud of my connection to Spartan Nation. So very excited to be part of the conversation here today. And my angle on this, I know that my title is a mouthful, and I'll get to that as well as my department, but my angle on this and looking at climate change is really through the lens of equity. So who do we need to think about as we transition to clean energy? By way of background, I'll tell you that I spent prior to my current position with the state of Michigan, I spent 4 years leading the Beyond Coal campaign here in Michigan for the Sierra Club. And so I spent a lot of time focused on transitioning our energy generation from coal-fired power plants to renewable energy. And I'm really proud of that work. And one of the things that stood out in that work was communities that were overburdened by a lot of the industrial pollution, coal plants included, and other areas that seem to have a real disparate and different impact on them. So I want to kind of start my talk this afternoon focusing on defining environmental justice. You heard the term energy justice earlier. Well, environmental justice is really born of the struggles of communities and people of color, low-income communities within different communities. I'm working to transition my slides. As soon as I figure that out, you'll see my next slide. So that's why I'm still talking to my title slide. Just want to point that out. But I wanted to just talk about the definition of environmental justice. It's about giving everyone equitable access to environmental laws and regulations. And so the important piece to that is how the EPA defines it, is that environmental justice is all about the fair and meaningful involvement of all people, regardless of their race, color, national origin, or income, with respect to the development, implementation, and enforcement of environmental laws and regulations. And that's a really important thing to consider as we're looking at how we transition to renewable, economy and renewable energy. So I just want to talk about the two pillars of environmental justice. And the first one is the fair treatment of all people. That seems obvious, but it's not so obvious when you think about the ways that our country operates and the things that people endure in a less than equitable way. So the other piece is meaningful involvement in public decisions and in government decision making. As you've heard from, the previous speakers and presenters, policy matters, and public engagement in government decisions matter. And who's included in that information really, really makes a difference in who's impacted as we move forward. So I want to ground you in some of the things that make environmental justice communities. And part of that is really focused on, proximity and exposure. There are many communities, oftentimes called frontline or fence line communities, where their homes are right up against significant presence of industry and pollution. There are people like our tribal communities and Native American communities who actually have unique exposure pathways to the way that they live their lives in terms of fishing and waterways that could potentially expose them to pollution and have disparate impacts. And then there are aging communities that have physical infrastructure that is falling apart or having a real degradation. And then of course, you heard, Charles prior to my presentation just talk about the impact of transportation and mass transportation on our environment, but the cumulative impacts of mobile source or transportation-based pollution coupled with exposure to other pollution for certain communities creates real disparate impacts. And these are factors we have to consider as we look at our transition away from fossil fuels to renewable energy. And we really have to make sure there are meaningful pathways to public participation for low-income communities and communities of color, and that we make that pathway to public participation very accessible for all communities. And so kind of the last disparate impact factor that I wanted to point out has to do with vulnerable communities. Children living in physical infrastructure that may expose them to things like lead through old paint and lead through other sources. So those are examples of disparate impact and factors that really could put people at a disadvantage in terms of environmental justice communities. So this looks like a big wheel, my graphic here, but really what it's showing is the interconnectivity and the intergenerational effects of environment and health and education, criminal justice, economic well-being, and housing. Those are all parts of environmental justice communities and what they're dealing with. And they're doing that really impacted by that because of structural inequity. You know, so the policies like we've talked to before, cultural norms that may expose certain populations to different things in a disparate manner, laws, social acceptance, the way that our country runs. There are a lot of reasons that these effects all, you know, kind of come together in environmental justice communities. So typically those communities aren't just experiencing direct environmental impact, but all of these social impact factors that also impact their lives. So I want to ground us in understanding of what equity really is. And, you know, you see diversity versus inclusion, and really diversity is about just points of difference. You know, I tend to be considered short by some standards. I'm only 5'2", and I think probably this is not a exact data point, but probably 90% of the population is taller than I am. So I'm short. I am a Black woman. I have differences from other people who may have participated in this particular webinar. But inclusion says that you don't just leave differences as a point of contention, but actually you include folks from varying perspectives into the conversation. And I will relate that back to our conversation about climate change and talk about just how important it is to ensure that that conversation is inclusive. And then equity versus equality. So equality pretty much means you treat everything the same, you do one blanket thing that should work for everybody. Equity says you take into account what is already being experienced, and then you try to work to give people what they need versus giving everybody the same thing because the needs are different. And where that relates to climate change is many communities that are already overburdened by pollution will not benefit equitably from some of the policies that are just looking toward addressing climate change without thinking about how you make those communities safe and whole in the process. And so my position here in the state of Michigan is a new position. Governor Gretchen Whitmer, about a year ago in 2019, early in her administration, produced an executive order that created the Office of the Environmental Justice Public Advocate. And many states have environmental justice offices, probably not enough states, but some states. And I think the difference here is that this is a public advocate office, which means you're not only advocating, you're not only informing people about environmental justice issues, you're both working as an advocate internally and externally to ensure that people have access to meaningful engagement and that government is looking at policies that are really going to make environmental justice communities whole and get to the justice that we seek. In addition to my office, in that same executive order, there was the creation of the Office of Climate and Energy. And that office is led by Dr. Brandy Brown. And really our offices work very closely and collaboratively to ensure that as the state moves forward to address climate impacts, they do so through a lens of equity, and that equity is prioritized in the work that we do to move the state forward and to make sure people have less of an impact. I mean, you heard earlier just how extreme events will become the norm as climate change moves forward. Well, when environmental justice communities experience those extreme events, oftentimes they have devastating effects on those communities because of pre-existing issues like poverty, like the already limited access they may have to engage in opportunities to change policies that could make their lives different. And so as we look at how sustainability efforts move forward, thinking about environmental justice communities, it is imperative that we think about that in ways that we can prepare to support environmental justice communities as extreme events happen. I mean, unfortunately, we can think of events like what happened with Hurricane Katrina and the folks who were left without transportation, without a way to get out of New Orleans at a time when an early example of what could happen, kind of a precursor to where we are now, when we're not thinking about how we work with communities that may need something more than just equal treatment when an extreme event happens. And so, this particular slide that I have on here is really about how we connect those sustainability efforts and environmental justice communities. So corporations who run both companies, industrial sites, they really have to start connecting with communities that they serve. So it's not just on government, it's also on the businesses, because they play a critical role in helping to ensure that there is both equity and justice for those communities. So I always like to talk about who's in this. We're in this together. One of the things that I think is a tenet of environmental justice organizing, and it's also important for all of us as we move forward in our new reality that is very much affected by climate change, is that we look at, some of the principles of the Hamas, principles, which are kind of a guiding light for environmental justice activism and work. And one of the ones that I particularly think is important is one where you let communities speak for themselves. And I think that's a critical piece of engagement as we talk to folks about what it is they're experiencing, their lived experiences, and how we move forward on those. So creating an equitable lens for environmental justice, you want to pose several questions as you do the work. As you plan to mitigate climate change, you need to look at how you can be intentionally inclusive in the planning and the work to address climate change. And you also want to think about, how to make sure that equity is an element of how we do our work, not an add-on or something you think about after you've already gotten the plans together, because the planning process must include frontline communities, must include impacted communities, must include a variety of voices. So it's not just, oh, look at this plan and tell us what you think. It's here, you're at the table as we plan. We want to see what impacts can have there might be on your community. What's the impact? And then we want to build that into our planning process. And then you want to hear from, use a broader lens, hear different perspectives, because I think that's critical in how we move forward, ensuring that all of us have an opportunity to really gauge the impact and potential impact of policies and other things. It's great to have policies that will mitigate climate change, but we really have to think about what happens next? What are the considerations? So you have to look at how overburdened communities and, assess cumulative impacts. So whether you have mobile source pollution, you have industrial sites, you might have impacted waterways, and what are mitigation strategies that can be integrated into that planning process? And also looking at just transition for communities and employees, because as we transition to a green economy, the jobs are different. So we do want to make sure that there are opportunities for folks and communities to avail themselves of green jobs, but we also want to ensure that we're training folks who may be transitioning away from a fossil fuel job at an industrial site or a place that may have employed hundreds. How do they benefit in this new world order? And how do communities who have spent decades maybe depending on tax revenue from a coal plant or an industrial site, when we transition away from that coal plant site being a primary provider of taxes in that community, how do we plan to help those communities make that transition where people are thought about in the process. And then, of course, providing opportunities for meaningful engagement all along the way to make sure there's equitable opportunity for participation for impacted communities. And I know that is a lot, but I think nothing we talk about is as important as ensuring that climate change policy, climate change plans, and how we look to move forward include all of us, right? Include everyone and are equitable and seen through that lens. So I know that was a lot. I was trying not to go over because I really want to hear your questions and look forward to the dialogue. So thank you so much for the opportunity. So Amy, I think it's back to you.
Thank you. Do you want to stop sharing your screen?
Okay, you know, it's going to take me a minute to figure it out. Okay, got it.
Fine. Okay. One of the questions and comments that came up, first of all, and for all the panelists, when we were talking about renewable energy at Michigan State, one of the things that has been really important is that students have really been strong advocates in transitioning to renewable energy, getting off coal, and playing a significant role in transforming the campus. We do have a number of students that are participating in the webinar today. So I'd like to hear from the panelists what the role of students can be and how can students get engaged in helping to take action towards climate issues.
So I'll start. One of the things that I think is critically important is that advocates, student advocates, others just get involved in exactly the ways you described. I remember in my days at Sierra Club a couple years ago, when there was strong advocacy from the Sierra Club student group to have the university transition from a coal-fired power plant to another source, right? And that advocacy, I think, moved the needle at the university. And that same advocacy can move the needle beyond that. And I think it's so important to have advocacy. I mean, kind of the reason my title has advocate in it is I'm a strong believer in, you know, advocacy. I see this continuum of change from agitation. Sometimes you have to bring attention to the issue, right? And then advocacy, honing your ask, and then negotiation to figure out what policy gets you there. So I absolutely encourage students who are interested to find ways to influence both the policy and the planning as it relates to pushing back against climate change and pushing for renewables.
Regina, this is exactly right. I drove the fuel switch inside the administration, but partnering with the Sierra Club, with the Beyond Coal movement and other student groups made my life so much easier, because then I could say, oh, it's not just me. It's our students that are pushing for this too. And what is the reason for a university to exist if it's not for the students? So students have much, much bigger voices collectively than is generally appreciated.
Yeah, I'll also add that from, you know, just the perspective of another university down the road, students made a huge difference at the University of Michigan, going to the Regents meetings every month until, for like a year, until the president finally declared, you know, a pledge toward carbon neutrality, set up a presidential commission, and has now started a process to come up with a plan for the university. Again, the students were essential in making that happen. And without it, I'm not sure that we'd be anywhere close to where we are today. I'll also note that you know, since I know there may be some high school students on the line today, we've seen a tremendous outpouring of youth in all, you know, at all levels, getting involved in the climate movement and demanding more of their leaders. And again, I think that is absolutely essential if we're going to solve this, you know, this crisis, and hopefully also elect better leaders that will get us the policies that we need.
There is also a question about, that goes along with this, about getting those pro-green energy advocates to show up at county and township meetings where projects and planning are happening. And how do you get people to show up to get engaged in that community? How do we make our voices heard?
Showing up is 85% of victory. If you don't go there, you're not going to be heard. But if you do and you show up in numbers, that is often really all that's needed, because we do live in a democracy. It matters what the majority of the people think. And the decision makers in township commissions and county commissions and statewide, they need to hear from citizens.
And I think that goes along with what I mentioned earlier about communities speaking for themselves. You know, elected officials are moved when their constituents move them. And so there's a real opportunity to have people in the community see how it connects to what they are pushing for, what they're advocating for. And I think the key there is just to understand how to motivate people, work on how to organize, get folks out. Because although a lot of people may think of themselves as green advocates, they may do it in the comfort of their home. They may not realize that it takes them actually showing up at a meeting like that to really make a difference. And I think that's where the organizing comes in and outreach comes in, to get people to understand what it really takes to change policy.
So that's one big action step that every single person that's watching this webinar right now can take, is to get engaged, get active, and make your voice heard. We had a question that came up around the cost of solar panels and the investment, and how that compares with the amount of energy that we get out of the panels at the university. Wolfgang, can you talk a little bit more about that?
Yes. So I started out saying energy is money. So we can directly translate the two into each other. And if you have to put more energy into producing the solar panel than you get out of it over its lifetime, then it's a losing proposition, not just for the environment, but also for the pocketbook. Now, with the power purchase agreement, I don't even have to think about this. Investors have to think about it and decide if they can put their money there and it will earn them a positive return. And that is happening. So just from these investment decisions, it's clear that there's more energy that is produced by the solar panel than what it takes to produce them. Mm-hmm. Now, as we refine these industrial processes, it gets better and better. The efficiency in solar panels is slowly going up over time, but it's also becoming more and more efficient to make these solar panels at scale. So typically, I would say you can get now about 5 to 10 times more energy out of the solar panels over their lifetime before they have to be rebuilt than what you had to put in. I will also say there's another question on, is anybody thinking about recycling these solar panel materials? And I can answer that right away also. One example is First Solar. It's a manufacturer in Toledo, mainly in Toledo, Ohio. And their solar panels are based on cadmium telluride compounds. And I toured their facilities and their recycling facilities, and they can do an almost complete 100% recycling at the end of the useful lifetime of their panels. With the panels that we're using at Michigan State, which are silicon monocrystal, it's even easier because silicon just can be melted down and poured into a new monocrystal and be completely recycled. Yes, it takes some energy, but that's already included in these energy considerations that I just addressed.
Charles, there's a question on road maintenance. is paid for with fuel taxes, and EVs do not use as much fuel. Do you have any thoughts on that and readjusting how roads are funded given the increased use of EV vehicles?
You're muted.
You're muted, Charles.
Got it. Just slow on the uptake there. Yes, I do. In fact, we did a report on this, as I mentioned in my presentation. It's what a lot of people don't realize is that in Michigan, for example, we pay for roads not only with gas taxes, but also with registration fees that are based on the price of the car, the purchase price. So, as I mentioned, electric cars tend to cost more today than a similar, non-electric vehicle. And because of that, electric vehicles actually are already paying significantly more toward the roads than similar gasoline vehicles. Putting an additional surcharge, an additional registration fee on those vehicles then becomes duplicative and means that when you add it all up, the electric vehicles end up paying significantly more than a similar, or even in some cases an identical model. The only thing that's different is, let's just take a Ford Fusion. There's a hybrid and then there's a plug-in hybrid version. Well, if you compare just the fees of those two vehicles, the electric version under Michigan rules was paying significantly more than that hybrid version. Why? The original reason for putting that surcharge on there is not needed because it's they're already paying more. I could say more, and I did respond to one question already in the Q&A about this topic.
There's a question that, and we've already seen some of this happening in Michigan, in reusing brownfield sites for renewable energy projects, especially those places where there isn't necessarily a business interest in reusing those. But how does that discussion impact low-income communities living around those brownfield sites? Regina, have you had any discussion or involvement in that kind of question at this time?
So a couple things, absolutely. I think that is one of the things that really has to be looked at in terms of reuse of brownfields. Are they in a position to be prioritized for opportunities for solar arrays? Oftentimes brownfields are in urban areas. They may not be obviously the best sites for wind turbines, but it's a really compelling case for solar panels, and oftentimes even looking at opportunities for community solar and other things where, we've talked a lot about options, and time again, you hear whether it's solar panels or electric vehicles, cost can be a barrier, right? And so having that opportunity to use a site that is funded not just by one person at one home, but by a community, and reuse of a brownfield would be an absolute great use of that site if it is one that is located in a place that is the best, for solar. Not all brownfields are for a variety of reasons, but absolutely that is something that is encouraged and being looked at, because I think you're right. It just seems to make sense as we transition. And I think it makes a statement as well to take it from an industrial past to a renewable future.
And there's one question that I'd love that I'm sure that you were anticipating getting for all the panelists, that they would like to hear how the changes that we're currently undergoing in the COVID crisis also present opportunities for the behavioral change that we may need for the climate change efforts.
I don't know who wants to start. I tend to be talkative. So, there's a thing in community organizing is to step back so others can step forward. So if anybody else wants to go first, they can. And if not, I will. I don't see either one of you raising your hands. Okay, so, I mean, I think for us, it really, again, using that lens of equity, I mean, I think we are seeing some very unfortunate results from how COVID has changed our world, and the impact on lower income communities and communities that may be environmental justice communities. I mean, for some folks, staying at home is an option, you know, and it's an inconvenience, and I gotta watch Netflix. Well, for other people, it is a matter of survival. I mean, if you are living in a situation where you have to go out to get what you need every single day, and you have to survive, and you have to make those tough choices, that is something that, you know, really impacts your ability, one, to adhere to things. You know, we run into a lot of issues that lower income communities and environmental justice communities are dealing with right now that make it harder for them to protect themselves from the COVID outbreak. And so I think for us, again, that lens of equity as we move forward is so critical, and hopefully policy change will follow this on a whole lot of fronts, as it relates to access to water, as it relates to, because you can't wash your hands if you don't have water, right? So, you know, water is critical to being able to protect yourself now. So, and policy changes that really point to how we really deal with communities that maybe have a disadvantage in a lot of areas, as well as, you know, I think the link between climate change and public health is in stark relief right now.
Well, I can add something to this. So Paul Romer, the Stanford economist who got the Nobel Prize a couple of years ago, he's famous for saying a crisis is a terrible thing to waste. And this crisis actually has yielded a lot of additional insights with a lot of people, like how to change their travel and work patterns and what is really essential. And, you know, we're investing $2 trillion to get the economy up on its feet, and it may not be enough, but individual states have taken the lead. For example, New York, Amy sent me a link this morning where the New York governor, Andrew Cuomo, has put forward proposals to use some of that recovery money to invest in renewable technologies. So this, I think, will yield a much greater push towards climate change goals. If we can invest $2 trillion to get the economy back on its feet, then let's do it right and invest it in the right technologies. We have an unprecedented level of new unemployment claims. And if we channel the funds right, we can create a lot of excellent paying jobs for people in the renewable sector. You know, there was this effort in the Trump administration to help the coal miners, but all coal miners in the entire United States will fit into Spartan Stadium, whereas people employed in the renewable energy industry number in the millions already. So, you know, this COVID crisis gives us time to think what is really important in our society, and renewable energy and keeping the planet habitable is definitely up there on the list.
So we're close to our time. So two big takeaways that I heard today of what we can do is get involved in your community, get involved in the planning. And then the other one I think is a great way to close with is what are our priorities and what is important to society, that we have a chance now to really look at what we do, how we do it, and what is important to us from a different lens than we've ever had before. In the follow-up, emails that all the participants will get, I will be sure to list a couple of resources. ASHE.org/climate solutions has a series where you can sign up for policy alerts and get involved. And there's also a couple other climate action groups where you can actually sign up and get involved as well. And then you'll also have the resources to all of our panelists. I'd like to thank everybody for participating. It's been tremendous. We've had almost 200 people and we have tons of questions. We'll take a look and see if we can do maybe a frequently asked questions that goes along with it, so we can post that information on our website. And again, thank you to our speakers and to our sponsors. And with that, we will close for the evening. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Amy.